So back in February, before the world went a little bit crazy, we got to do a whole Roth family vacation on the beach. And this is something that we had never done before. And my dad made it possible for us to all go down together and be together. It was 1 year after my mom had died, so it was kind of a time to remember and celebrate and be together. And you know, my family, we usually don't travel like that. Lisi and I and our boys, we travel pretty cheap. And so often we're either visiting family, or if we're not visiting family, then we've got something that we're doing. So it's kind of go, see the sights, go for a hike, whatever. But you know, there's a lot of movement. But on this trip, we really didn't have too much to do. There we were just on the beach and hanging out together. We just rested. And it turned out to be something that we really needed. Now, we're launching a new series today, and it's called Christ in the Feast. And each week, we're going to be looking at a feast from the ancient Israel in Leviticus 23 and seeing how those feasts are fulfilled in Christ and interpreted by him. And my hope is that we will learn something about the Bible, but more importantly, that by studying those feasts and seeing how they are filtered into Jesus' life, we will learn something about Jesus' character and mission. Now, the first of those festivals or feasts in Leviticus 23 is the Sabbath. And it's listed among the 7 festivals of Israel. And I don't know about you, but you might not think about Sabbath as a festival because it happens every 7 days, right? But in reality, all of the other festivals are rooted in the Sabbath. And so to observe the festivals is to observe the Sabbath. And every Sabbath day has a festive character. And what all of these days have in common is that they reorder our time. And they reorder us in time. They really reorder our sense of time. The Sabbath in particular reorders our time towards God's rest. And that's what I want to help us here today. The Sabbath reorders our time towards God's rest. And listen, like we discovered on this vacation, we need rest. You know, every day, every year, our church, we pick a theme that we're going to use as an orienting theme for the year. And so for 2020, we picked the year of celebration. In fact, this is kind of part of why I wanted to look at these festivals, right? Like, how did ancient Israel celebrate? If we're going to be spending this year thinking about celebration, then I wanted to help us get oriented towards celebration through the scriptures. And it would be a time just to name all the abundance and the good things that God is doing among us and celebrate that, right? Celebrate together. Now, unfortunately, this has not played out like I had in mind. My thought was that by studying these festivals, we'd get to celebrate together, but here we are in this time of quarantine. But I want to tell you a little secret. I really haven't told too many people this, but I'm going to tell you. Before I started pitching the idea of the year of celebration to our leadership teams, I was toying with another theme. And I was really reflecting about our lives, both as a church and as our family and as a community. And I was reflecting on the need to refocus this year. And I was looking at my own family and noticing how we are always just running everywhere for sports and for 4-H and for gardening and band concerts and church and school. And I love these things. These are good things. But I secretly thought to myself, what would happen if we called 2020 the year of rest? What if we just cut out as many meetings as possible, just tried to live as simply as possible, just get back to the basics? And I was feeling the need personally for something like that. Pare back on all the things that we've been doing and refocus the year of rest. That's my secret. And I don't want to say that I prayed for that or anything, but I sort of got my wish because here we all of us have had to rethink our lives and take a good look at what matters most. And even though there's been a lot of cancellations, I don't know if they've been all that restful. There's a lot of loss involved, and I miss those activities. I mean, the kids need school, and people are obviously hurting because we're out of work. This was not the kind of paring back and rest that I had in mind. But one thing that this whole pandemic is causing us to do is to take stock of our lives and how we spend our time. We're all getting a chance to refocus. And I don't know that I can say that it's been rest, because I, for one, find that it takes a lot of additional thinking and effort and time. But at the very least, it has been a time for mental regrouping. Who am I? How do I measure my worth? What does it mean for my life to count for something? And these questions that are really fresh questions right now, I think for a lot of us, or at least they are for me, they're especially fresh because our government has divided everybody into essential and non-essential workers. And I get it, right? We're trying to keep people from going out and getting infected and getting other people sick. But there it is, right out in front. You are either, according to government classification, essential or non-essential. Now, I saw a t-shirt the other day that said, "I'm an essential worker," which means that I'm sort of a big deal. But even without the government's declaration, I wonder if we weren't always doing this a little, kind of dividing people in our heads between essential and non-essential based on the work that they do. And one of the things that the Sabbath does is teach us that each of us is worthy of love and respect and dignity by virtue of being born. We do not have to do anything to earn that. And the Sabbath teaches us that we are all essential regardless of the work that we do. And sometimes I think we're even our own worst critics, and we question whether anything that we do is essential. Does anything I do matter? And I think these are questions that ought to be brought to the festivals in Leviticus 23, and especially to the Sabbath. And this is because of what the festivals are, their deep meaning. And in our culture, it's really easy to not take festivals all that seriously because there is this entire industry that is based on buying stuff for holidays throughout the year. And this is why, if you've noticed, as soon as Thanksgiving is over, the Christmas stuff is out, and as soon as Christmas is over, the Valentine's Day stuff is out, and as soon as Valentine's Day is gone, then it's St. Patrick's Day, which I guess St. Patrick's Day is just kind of this international celebration of all things Irish and green. And then Mother's Day, and then dads and grads, and the list goes on, right? There's this whole industry devoted to getting us to follow these holidays, and some of them are holier days than others, so that we buy cards and chocolates and glittery shamrocks. And in my opinion, our best bet is to try to ignore a whole lot of these made-up holidays as much as possible. But the festivals of ancient Israel were totally different. There was the Sabbath plus 6 or 7 more, depending on how you count Passover and unleavened bread, whether they're 1 or 2, 3 in the spring, 3 in the fall. And some of these festivals were pilgrimage festivals, so Passover and weeks and tabernacles. And for these festivals, the people journeyed on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. These festivals all involved sacrifice. So these are festivals that cost something. They required people to go on a trip or to make a sacrifice. They required people to reorder their lives, to reorder their possessions. And that's what the festivals are ultimately about, reordering people to God. These are festivals that are about identity. Because how we spend our time will say a whole lot about our values. And how we spend our time will say a whole lot of how we are being shaped and what we're becoming. Who are we? What do we make time for? And nowhere is this more the case than in Sabbath. Every week, the Sabbath was meant to inculcate a set of values into the people of Israel. So Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel says this: "Ceasing from work every 7th day reminds us that the ultimate goal of our life is fellowship with God." That the people of Israel are to cease work is about the only thing that the scriptures say about the Sabbath in Leviticus 23. There's not a whole lot of detail. So verse 3, "There are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. Wherever you live, it is a Sabbath to the Lord." And it takes place on the 7th day, and it says don't do any work. That's it. So 7th day, no work. That's pretty much all the instructions that Leviticus 23 gives us. Now, of course, you learn more about the Sabbath in the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments, which are in Exodus chapter 20 and Deuteronomy 5, the 10 Commandments tell us that it's not just a day of rest for the rich and famous or a day of rest for the head of the household. It's a day of rest for everybody. It extends down through sons, daughters, servants, even the animals. Everybody, in Deuteronomy 5 says, even people who are resident aliens, everybody has the right to a Sabbath. Everybody rests. And according to Exodus 20, this rest is because God rested after creating the world. It is a rest that is rooted in God's very creation and that is rooted in God's very character. It is a rest that is rooted in the order of creation. And in the Ten Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, we learn that it's also a rest because the people of Israel were once slaves in Egypt. When they were slaves, they could not rest. Their lives were oriented and defined by work, whatever work their masters set over them. But they are a free people now in a free land, and they are to take a rest. The Sabbath is this repetitive call to take a rest. It's very straightforward. Every 7 days, you have to rest. And that pause, that stepping back, shaped the people of Israel. It formed them. They had time to celebrate. They had time to worship. They had time to just sit around and talk, no agenda, no purpose, just good old-fashioned loafing. And we need this too. We need a Sabbath in time. We need a day of rest. And I think part of what the Sabbath does for the people of God is remind us that while we may derive our worth and identity from what we do, we may consider ourselves essential because of our job, but we are ultimately not our work. We're more than our work. And sometimes people become workaholics, and they become workaholics because they're trying to pay off debt or make ends meet, or they're saving for some future goal. But I think a lot of times what's driving that workaholicism is that we derive identity from our work. And so sometimes we feel, well, if we're not working, who are we? But God rested, and so thus we should too. And the funny thing about this is, what does it mean to say that God rested? I mean, God's not like a human being or an animal that he would get tired. I mean, his creation didn't wear him out. God created the work out of his infinite capacity, and God never gets to the end of his strength and power. But God rested to show us that we have to take time from doing to just be. We're always at risk of becoming human doings rather than human beings. And God rested to show us just how to be. And we see how all this fits together in Hebrews chapter 4, which is a passage in the New Testament that interprets the idea of Sabbath in light of Jesus. And now Hebrews 4 is really an extended reflection on Psalm 95 and Genesis 2:2, both of which speak of the rest that God gives. And Hebrews verse 1 says this, the promises of entering his rest still stands. And verse 3, we who have believed enter that rest. And then verse 9, there remains then a Sabbath rest for the people of God. This is really key. A Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. It's not something just for the past. It's not something just for the Jewish people. Sabbath is a gift that God has given us as followers of Jesus. But just what day is the Sabbath? I mean, it's pretty clear from the Ten Commandments that the Sabbath is the last day of the week. In Jewish reckoning, the Sabbath begins Friday night and ends on Saturday night. Sabbath is a day to rest from our labors, and it's also a day to engage in corporate worship. But for the most part, Christians worship on Sunday. What's up with that? Well, early in the life of the church, the Sabbath got moved. So you already see this in Acts chapter 20, verse 7, where you see Paul and company gathering on the first day of the week, that is Sunday, to break bread, which means celebrate the Lord's Supper. And Paul also preaches at that time. In fact, that's the story where Paul preaches so much that poor Eutychus, this young guy sitting in a window, he falls asleep, and he falls out of that window and dies, but Paul revives him. Now, other post-biblical writers in the early church, including someone named Justin Martyr, who writes from Rome, they also speak about Christians worshiping on Sunday. And the reason for this is fairly straightforward. For Christians, the defining time for us is the day of resurrection. It is Easter, and that is always Sunday. It's the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And because Jesus was raised, that changes everything. We are stepping into a new ordering of time, a new creation, and Sunday marks the dawning of that new era. So we worship on Sunday. But just who did the early church think it was changing the Sabbath from Saturday to Sunday? On what authority did the apostles think that they could do that? Well, just as you see Jesus quoting from the Old Testament in the Sermon on the Mount, and he says, you have heard that it was said, but I say to you, and then he interprets the heart of the law. I think the same thing happens with Sabbath. Jesus reinterprets the Sabbath in light of his life, death, and resurrection. So at one point he says that the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. And that's the same authority that he has given to the church to determine what day to worship. The great Christian philosopher Thomas Aquinas explains it like this. Aquinas reasoned that there are two parts to the Sabbath, the ceremonial part and the moral part. Now, that ceremonial piece is what is attached to the last day of the week in Israelite reckoning, so Friday night through Saturday night. That's the ceremonial aspect of the Sabbath. And as with all of the ceremonial law of the Old Testament, like the sacrifices and temple worship, all of that has been fulfilled in Jesus. But the moral aspect of the Old Testament law still stands. So for instance, the Ten Commandments, we still follow them. We do not kill, we do not commit adultery, we do not lie, and so on and so forth. All that still applies to us. And so it is with the Sabbath. We still have a moral obligation as God's people to take a day of rest once a week, except that now it is not on Saturday, but on Sunday, the day of resurrection. And I think this idea of a day of rest, it's just very practical. We are always at risk of getting sucked into the world's production line values that ultimately make us less than what God intends us to be. A lot of us have a hard time getting off the treadmill, stepping back from the rat race. If we think we could just run a little bit faster, we could achieve more. But it doesn't work like that. What really happens is that we end up becoming sleep-deprived caffeine slaves who rush through our day without a thought for what we're doing or who we're becoming. We so easily don't pay attention to what's going on around us or take the time to be with the people that God has placed in our lives. And then all of it's gone, washed out in a blur, and we reach that hard stop that waits for all of us sooner or later. It's really insidious the way that this attitude can sneak up on a person. It's not that any of us ever go out and say, hey, I'm going to become a workaholic, that, hey, I'm not going to pay attention to what's going on in my life. It happens slowly when we're not looking, and then it gets ingrained in us. I've been there. Back in February, Lisi and I both quit coffee. And I'd been drinking coffee since I was in high school, and I realized that I really didn't know what it looked like for me to be awake without caffeine in my system. And I felt that something was wrong with that. It's not that coffee in and of itself is wrong. The problem was a personal problem for me, that I had this sense that I was always fighting sleep, not wanting to succumb to the limits of my body and brain. And I was always trying to rush ahead to get more done because there's just so much that I want to do. And so I quit coffee. And I went through the usual headaches and the mornings where my brain felt like cotton. But now I feel like I'm more in tune with the rhythm of my body, and I'm not operating in this headlong rush through life. I'm trying to change my mentality. And this is part of how God created us, to rest. So for instance, we need to sleep every day. And most of us need to get around 8 hours of sleep. Sleep researcher Matthew Walker writes that there does not seem to be one major organ within the body or process within the brain that isn't optimally enhanced by sleep and detrimentally impaired when we don't get enough. And to be able to lay down our heads is also the practice for being able to lay down our lives. One biblical scholar writes, Sabbath keeping is creation keeping. To keep the Sabbath is to participate in God's intention for the rhythm of creation. It's recognizing that we are weak, that we need God's grace and we need grace from others. It's recognizing that our lives are short and everything that matters that we have will pass on to the next generation. We're releasing life and history to the God who never sleeps. The Lord gives sleep to his beloved, says the Psalms. And Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. All this is the lesson of the Sabbath. It's very practical. It's reordering our time towards God's rest. A Sabbath rest remains for the people of God. We all need a break. We need a chance to sit down and talk and loaf and just be. We all need that rest. But there's more to it. You see, the way that Hebrews talks about rest is really interesting because it's not just a break for Hebrews. It is, but it's not just a break. It's also a time to speak of God's presence in eternity. So rest is about God's presence. Verse 7 in Hebrews 4, God again set a certain day, calling it today. And that today is what Paul is talking about when he says, now is the day of salvation. It's a future rest in God's kingdom, like Revelation 14, where those who have died in Christ are said to rest from their labors. but it's to enter into God's peace that passes all understanding. It is rest that comes by faith. It is rest that is not anxious. It's rest that looks a little like God's rest, who though he rested on the seventh day, continued to be at work in the world and continued to labor to draw human beings to himself and history to completion. Have you ever experienced this kind of rest? I think it's the rest that comes, when you know something's about to happen and you can just be at peace with it. When we're able to release it and just let God have it and wait. For me, this kind of rest comes in fits and starts. Sometimes by God's grace, I can pull off this rest. Sometimes not so much. It's a rest that can enter into us even when we're busy. It's that moment where you kind of just are yourself in Christ, even when your life is in a state of motion and everything is swirling around you. Now, I don't know if you've ever had that kind of rest, if you've ever experienced that. In my mind, that rest flows directly from the Sabbath, because the Sabbath teaches us the art of release. And the Sabbath is also about worship and prayer. And there's a way in which this once-a-week release prepares us to be able to release things in the moment. And there's a way in which taking time to worship and pray on the Sabbath prepares us to pray wherever we find ourselves. And we especially need this right now, when our world has gotten all topsy-turvy. At first there were some school districts that tried to send home the same amount of work that the kids would have been doing in school. So they were kind of reasoning that if kids are in school 7 hours a day, we'll send home 7 hours of work. That did not last long. It just was not possible. Parents weren't going to be able to fill in as teachers because they still had jobs and they had to cook and had to take care of the house, and the kids were stressed out. Thankfully, our local school district here did not do that. But one of the lessons that people learned is that kids and parents had to rest. They just had to step back and let it go. I know our family had to do that. And over the last week or so, we've kind of started to get back into the swing of things and develop a rhythm. But I think a lot of parents were in the same boat, or at least maybe needed to hear this message. As parents, we got to step back. We have to step into the peace of Christ. We need to rest, and especially we need to rest in God. Brothers and sisters, a Sabbath rest still remains for the people of God. We need this Sabbath rest in the usual sense. Lay things down, let it go. And we need a Sabbath rest in the deep Christ-formed sense of entering into the peace of Christ that passes all understanding. So there you go. The peace of God be with you. God's rest embrace you. Make sure this afternoon that you get in a good Sabbath nap. Amen.